Hello YouTube and welcome back to another alternate history video. Today I got the 1976 presidential election, and this one is between George Wallace, the Democrat, who ran third party in 1968, won some southern states, tried for the Democratic nomination a couple more times in the 70s but didn't get it, but did win a few states in the primary. And this one is against Republican Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president under Nixon. Uh, and he did resign in office due to his time as governor, some scandals there with, like, I think bribery and stuff to do with taxes. And so he resigned because of that, and Ford took over as VP. He was appointed by the House. And so this scenario is if that didn't happen, like Spiro didn't have his scandals, and this is actually if Nixon serves 2 terms and he doesn't have his scandals either, which was Watergate. And so this scenario, like I said, is Nixon serves out his 2 terms and Spiro doesn't have any scandals either and decides to run for the 76th nomination. And George Wallace seeks the Democratic nomination and he actually gets it. So maybe Carter doesn't run in this scenario or Wallace beats him out for it somehow. But I'm going to go with Carter doesn't run and Wallace ends up getting it, kind of in an upset. So, like I said, this is pretty much going to be an open election because Nixon serves 2 terms, so the landscape is going to be pretty divided, I would say. We might see a little party fatigue due to 2 terms of Nixon, but Wallace also has his weaknesses with his past support of segregation. But I believe by this time he had actually changed up his stances and he became more against it. And he actually, I believe, won the black vote in one of his runs for governor in the 80s. So he had kind of changed by then, but he still supported a lot of on economics, like populist things, a lot of populist rhetoric that he espoused, and I think that would go over pretty well, especially in a lot of Rust Belt states and Midwestern and Appalachia, while Agnew, I'm sure, would do better throughout the rest of the country, like the Mountain West and the Plains and the West Coast, and especially the Northeast. And he was from Maryland. He was the governor there. So I think, like I said, these 2 gentlemen do well in the regions that they're from. And I think it kind of would make it a little closer in an election since it is, like I said, after 2 terms of Nixon. And there's no scandal, no Watergate, no resignation from Agnew, no resignation from Nixon either. So this is the actual map. Ford was the incumbent president, took over after Nixon resigned, and Carter was able to get the win. But like I said, this scenario here is Spiro Agnew versus Wallace after 2 terms of Nixon and no scandals or anything. But I think I'm still going to include the economy with inflation, which was a big issue during this time. So that's still going to happen in this scenario. But like I said, there's just no Watergate and none of that, none of Agnew's scandals. Just an open election with these 2 candidates. So getting into it, I believe Agnew is probably going to take these typical Mountain West states like Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, been really Republican stronghold, and I don't see that really changing, especially Wallace with his past support of segregation. But like I said, he did go against it around this time, and wouldn't really espouse that anymore. He would definitely push on economic issues, especially with inflation being an issue during this time, stagflation as they called it. And but I believe Agnew would take these states pretty much no problem. I don't think he'd be like the best fit for him because I don't think he was really a social conservative, but I don't think they definitely want to vote for Wallace, so Agnew would take these pretty solidly, I believe. As well as the state of Montana, same deal. And he'd probably take states like Arizona and Colorado. More sparsely populated back then. The cities weren't growing, have the growth that they do now. That are making them into more Democratic states today. More Republican definitely back then, so I believe they would stick with Agnew, and probably New Mexico as well. Also Alaska. He'd probably take these plain states, I'm sure, like the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma could be kind of close because I think Wallace could do really well, like especially in the southern part. And it was won by Ford, as you see here, and it was actually pretty close. It was decided by a point, and I think Wallace could pull it out possibly, especially doing great in the southern part like Carter did. I don't know if Agnew would do as good as Ford and where he did in the state, like in the panhandle part, I guess you want to call it. Uh, Honestly, I can maybe see Wallace flipping it due to him really running up in the southern part even more than Carter. It could still go Agnew because of like the cities like Tulsa, but I kind of have this feeling that Wallace might actually win it just because of southern Oklahoma. It would definitely improve on Carter's margins, I believe, and that'd be enough to get him it. I think it would win these deep South states, definitely like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and definitely his home state of Alabama where he was governor. Probably Georgia too, considering he won in 1968. I think he did really well in the rural areas, and Agnew might do a little bit better like around Atlanta and those more suburban counties. But I think Wallace would definitely sweep a lot of the rural areas and be enough to get him a pretty solid victory in the state. I think it would take South Carolina too. Uh, like I said, another southern state, Wallace would definitely have his appeal being from Alabama and running on things like economic populism. Although I don't think that's really a thing more like in southern states like Georgia. They kind of tend to more like physical conservatism, especially around the suburbs. But I think definitely a lot of the rural areas will still like him due to him being that southern Democrat. And that's why I think it would also take a state like North Carolina that Jimmy Carter also won. And he would probably take Kentucky and Tennessee because Carter won those also. And like I said, due to Wallace being from the South here, I think it would really have no problem winning these states because Agnew, I don't really see having that southern appeal. Being a Republican from Maryland, he would definitely have his appeal there in the Northeast and Mid Atlantic. And Wallace is probably going to take West Virginia too, due to it being more of a Democratic stronghold around this time. Definitely voted that way for many years. It barely went Republican. I believe it went for Reagan in '84, and I think it went for Nixon in '72. But other than that, it definitely had a Democratic streak, and I don't see that really breaking here. So I think Wallace would win it. A state like Indiana, I think would be kind of close. I think Wallace could do pretty well, especially in some of the rural areas. But I think since Indiana tends to have more Republican streak and so does today, that it could stick with Agnew. But I think it would be under 10, possibly like a 5 point margin maybe, or a little under. But I think due to like Indianapolis and the cities in the state, the suburbs, Agnew could do pretty well and still win it. But I think Wallace would definitely do well in southern Indiana because that's where Appalachia is, bordering Kentucky. So I think it would be kind of close. Like I said, it could be around 5 points or a little less, but I think Agnew could pull it out there since Ford was able to. And I think Agnew would take a state like Illinois as well. Due to Cook County, Chicago, Wallace would do better downstate in the rural areas, I believe, but I believe the suburbs in the state would hand Agnew the victory like it did Gerald Ford. I think a state like Missouri would be kind of close, maybe not though, because of Wallace being on the ballot. And I think I would go for him since I went for Jimmy Carter due to doing well, like I said, in rural areas. I think that would be enough to get him the state. It was more of a bellwether back then, more of a swing state. And I think that would be in Wallace's favor after 2 terms of Richard Nixon. A state like Nevada, I think would go for Agnew. Like I said, another one that went for Nixon. I think Agnew would do pretty decent enough, like in around Vegas and Reno, to win it. And maybe Wallace could do pretty good in some of the rural areas, but I don't know. Being more of a western state, though, I think Agnew would actually do a lot more better than it, especially than a southern state that I gave to Wallace. So I think Agnew would win that. And he'd probably take California, too. I'm pretty sure it was Nixon's home state, and I definitely see him running up in the cities. I don't really see Wallace competing here that much, especially being more of a West Coast state. And like I said, Wallace's strength would definitely be in the South and maybe some of the Rust Belt states due to economic populism. So I see Agnew taking California, also Oregon and Washington, I believe, due to his good margins in the cities. A state like Minnesota, I think would probably be more Agnew friendly. Maybe Wallace could do better in some of the rural areas, as I mentioned in other states. But I think due to Minneapolis and like the Twin Cities, St. Paul, that Agnew could pull it off. It did go for Carter in our timeline, but it's also because he had Mondale as his running mate, who was from there. But I think due to Wallace's past support of segregation, that would hurt him some, even though he did denounce it around this time. But I think that would still come back to haunt him, especially around the St. Paul and Minneapolis area, and I think that'd be enough to give Agnew a slight victory. Like I said, Wallace would run on economic populism, so that could help him some, especially with farmers Probably could help him better in the rural areas, but I think St. Paul, Minneapolis area would hand Agnew a slight victory there by a few points. And I think a state like Iowa would be another close one. I believe it actually went for 4 very narrowly. I think Wallace would compete pretty good, especially in rural areas. Kind of would do okay with farmers due to his run on economic populism. But I don't know how well, if he would do as good as Carter. Like I said, I think that's probably a toss-up. I might come back to that. I'm going to go to the Northeast here because this would be more Spiro's strengths. He's definitely going to win New Hampshire and Vermont. Vermont, especially being a Republican stronghold from statehood, only went for Lyndon B. Johnson, and then I believe was that about the only time, or once or twice, but went Republican a lot, and especially around this time. And Spiro Agnew definitely have that appeal, being from this region of Maryland. He's definitely the right fit for these states, a more moderate type of Republican, and I think it would win those with ease. And he'd probably take Massachusetts too. If I'm not mistaken, I think Wallace actually won Massachusetts surprisingly in the 72 primary. It was out of nowhere, but I believe he did win it, so he could make it kind of competitive, but I think since Agnew is from Maryland, he'd be more favored in this region, definitely, so I think that would give him the edge in the state. I see him definitely doing good in the cities. Like I said, Wallace maybe could do kind of decent if he did in the primary, but obviously that was just a primary victory, but when it comes to a general election, I think Agnew could pull it off due to him being more favored in this region. And he'd probably take a state like New York too. Perhaps Wallace could do kind of decent upstate, although I think Agnew could probably still do pretty good there too, because upstate New York, of course, been a lot different than rural areas of like the South. So I think Agnew would win this state pretty well. Definitely doing well in New York City and the boroughs, and that would give him a victory there. The state of Pennsylvania, I believe, would be a close one. If Wallace hits really hard on economic populism, that could be in his favor. I think he would definitely do well in the western part, like Carter did, as you see there. While Agnew would definitely do better in the rest of the state, especially in the suburbs of the state, like Chester, Bucks, Montgomery County. I believe that would be Agnew's strength. So it would make it a close one. And like I said, I believe Wallace would do well in the western part. I don't know if he'd win Erie County. Maybe it would since Carter did, but it could be a little closer. But I think if Wallace is really hammering the message on economic populism, that could give him the state. But if Agnew's doing kind of well in some of the suburbs too, that would definitely make it a nail biter, I believe. But this might be a really bold call, but I could actually see PA going for Wallace. Because, like I said, around this time, he'd really denounced his past views on segregation. And I think if he's really hitting hard on the economic issue, especially since that was a big issue in this election with stagflation, that could get him the narrow victory in the state. Like I said, it could go for Agnew because of the suburbs, but I think if Wallace is really hitting on the economic issue, that'd be enough to get him the state, especially doing good in the western part, as I explained. And like I said, it's probably a bold call, but I think if he's really pushing hard on economics, that would give him the victory. But you can disagree if you want. But I think that's definitely kind of a tough one. But I'll give it to Wallace since it's a little bit of party fatigue after 2 terms of Nixon, so that would definitely come into play too. So I'll give that to Wallace. State of Virginia here would be a close one. I believe Wallace would do well in rural areas, of course. But those northern suburbs tended to be more Republican back then. And I think that would definitely be in Agnew's favor, especially being from Maryland. He'd definitely do well around that area, bordering D.C. and Maryland. So I think that would be enough to go in the state by a couple points. It was definitely close in our timeline, with Ford barely winning against Carter. But I think Agnew would definitely do well in the northern part like Ford did, especially being from bordering Maryland. And I think that'd be enough to get in the state by a point or two. And I think it definitely went his home state of Maryland. As I mentioned, he was governor there, and I think this was actually another state that I believe Wallace won in the 72 primary, just like Massachusetts. So pretty interesting there. Maybe Wallace could do kind of well in like the panhandle of the state. But I think definitely the cities like Baltimore, suburbs of the state would hand Agnew the victory, and of course being the governor there would definitely have his appeal. So I'll give that to him. A state like Rhode Island, Connecticut, I think would go for Agnew. I believe they went for Ford. And in fact, they did. Well, Rhode Island actually went for Carter. But I believe it was, okay, so it was actually New Jersey and Connecticut that went for Agnew, so I'll take that back off the board. I'll give him Connecticut and New Jersey since they went for Ford, and that does actually put him over the top. So he wins here with 274. But moving on with the rest of the states. Let's see. The state of Rhode Island, like I said, actually went for Carter. And I think it would be much closer, especially with Wallace. Maybe Wallace could still pull out a narrow victory there due to it being after 2 terms of Nixon, but I don't really know how well his message of being a former segregationist will play out here. I don't think too well. So I'm actually going to have the state to Agnew because of that. Like I said, it could still be possibly a close one due to Carter winning it by the margin he did, but I just don't see Wallace with his passport segregation having the same strength. And he was a bit more of a conservative Democrat, if you want to call him that, which I guess is pretty true, considering I think his son is actually a Republican now. So, yeah, I think Agnew would take that due to Wallace not being much of a liberal. So moving on to Delaware here. Another Carter state. Not as big as Rhode Island, so in that case, this probably be another one to go for Agnew. You definitely have a strength, especially being from bordering Maryland. And like I was explaining with Rhode Island, Wallace isn't really that liberal on certain issues. He'd be more of a conservative Democrat, so I think that would be his weakness in this region. And that'd be enough to give Agnew the state. D.C., however, it would be an interesting one. It's been really Democratic. Every Democrat's pretty much won it. And you say there's no contest there. I think Wallace wouldn't do as well, obviously, as other Democrats. But I think I just don't think all those votes are really going to flip overnight. So Wallace would probably still take it, but it'd probably be a reduced margin from what Carter won it. Like I said, I don't really see it flipping. All those votes just flipping all of a sudden, especially with how big of a victory it was. So it'd probably still go to Wallace. Maybe it could still win the black vote, considering he did like in the 80s, I think, when he ran for governor. So I think that'd still be enough to give him the state. But he probably wouldn't do as well as other Democrats. Be more of a lukewarm victory for him, but I think it could pull it off due to D.C. voting Democratic since it's become part of the Electoral College. But we got a few more states left here. I'm actually going to go up to Maine here. It all went for Ford, so in that case, it's probably all going to go for Agnew. The second district could be interesting. Maybe Wallace could compete pretty well there, considering it's more of a rural district. And it's more of a Trumpian district, too, now in our modern day. So that could probably play well in Wallace's hands. But I think if Ford was able to pull it off, that Agnew could, too, especially being from this region. Having great appeal, I think it could pull it off. And there's remaining states. A state like Hawaii was actually for Carter. It was only by a couple points, though, interestingly. And like I was saying about Wallace's passport segregation, though, definitely come back to bite him, I think. And I think that'd be enough for Agnew to actually get a win in the state. It's rarely voted Republican. I believe it actually went for Nixon in 72. And I want to say it went for Reagan in 84. And I think this would be another rare instance where it vote Republican. And it was actually close in our timeline, which is why I could see it flipping to Agnew here with Wallace being on the ballot. And a state like Texas, I think, would actually go for Wallace. Like I said, due to him being a Southern Democrat, I think would be enough to do well in the rural areas. Agnew would probably do better like around Austin, Dallas, Houston, those places. But I believe the rural areas would hand Wallace the victory, as I've mentioned in these other states. And same though in Florida, I think it would take that. It's doing really well in the Panhandle, northern Florida. Agnew would probably do better in southern, central Florida, like Tampa, Pinellas, those more cities in the state. But I think Wallace definitely run up in the rural areas and take the state of Florida like Carter did. And that leads me to Ohio, which also went for Carter. I can honestly see that being another state for Wallace because I think he'd do really well in the rural areas like Carter did. Agnew would do better in some of the cities like Cleveland and Toledo, places in northern Ohio. But I could see Wallace doing kind of okay in northeastern Ohio too. That tends to be more of a working class area of the state. And I think he'd really run, like I said, on the economic populism message like he did in the primaries. And I think he'd definitely do in the general election, being a year of stagflation. And I think that he would actually pull out a victory there. Like I said, I think if he was definitely running in the rural areas and running on populism economics against stagflation, they could pull it out. Just like in Pennsylvania, if he's doing well in Western PA, as I mentioned. And this leads me back to the state of Iowa, as I was talking about earlier. Uh, Perhaps Wallace could pull it off. Like I said, like I was talking about in Ohio, due to doing well in rural areas, running on economic populism, I think could be enough to get him the win. It was narrow in our timeline, and I don't really see Agnew doing as well in the state as Ford would, since he's not the incumbent president. So I think Wallace could actually pull it off, especially with 2 terms of Nixon, as I mentioned, these other states. Economic populism would win the day for Wallace. And that leads me to the last 2 states of Michigan and Wisconsin, which would definitely be in play. As I've explained, the economic populism message would definitely resonate with a lot of folks in this state. Carter did better in this part. Ford actually did pretty well in this part, like the Driftless area. Of course, Carter did better in a place like Milwaukee and Madison, and was only by a little over a point. If Wallace is really well on economic populism, that would help him in the state. Agnew, I think, would still have his strengths more in the cities, but it tend to be more democratic, like Madison, Milwaukee. And maybe Wallace could pull out a narrow win here. Like I said, it's another bold call, just like Pennsylvania. I think he definitely has a better shot winning a state like Iowa and Ohio than he does Wisconsin. But like I said, if he's really hammering on the economic issue, I think that could be enough to get him the state by a narrow win, just like Carter did. Michigan, however, was Ford's home state, and I believe this was another one that Wallace actually did well in the 72 primary. This was tend to be more a little of a Republican state around this time, as seen here. It was a bigger victory for Ford than it was for Carter in Wisconsin. And of course, like I said, Ford's home state. I could see definitely Agnew doing well in places like Macomb County and Wayne County, Oakland. I think he'd do well in those places. Wallace could do pretty good in some of the rural areas. And I think I could make it a close one if Wallace is around economic populism. But I think since Michigan tended to have more of a Republican streak around this time, that Agnew could pull it off. And I think it would definitely have the backing of somebody like Ford, who isn't running in this scenario. I think it would campaign for Agnew, and that would help him get the state by a couple points or so, due to Oakland, Macomb, and the suburban counties in the state. I think would hand him the victory. And this is the final map. Spiro Agnew wins 310. George Wallace is 227. So sort of a close election. As I explained at the beginning, I think it would have been kind of closer like this, especially after two terms of Nixon. You have stagflation. Like I said, there is no Watergate in this scenario, no resignation from Agnew either, so that's why he gets a nomination and wins. But it would be a much closer election than like 72, especially when that was a big landslide against McGovern. So I think party fatigue would come into play, and Wallace would definitely run on the economic populism issue. That would help him Rust Belt and definitely do well in southern states where he was from. And like I said, Agnew doing well in the Northeast due to him being from Maryland, doing well in the Plains and West Coast states, and Alaska, Hawaii. And that does give him the victory, 310, 227. If you agree with this or not, just comment below what you think of it. If you agree, if you think Agnew would win more states, if you think I'm overestimating Wallace, or if I'm actually underestimating him, just comment below what you think of this. If you think it would be this close, or you think Agnew would win more states, as I said, or if Wallace would actually pull out the victory. Yeah, just like I said, comment below that. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, hit the bell for notifications. I thank you for watching, and I'll see